Richard for setting this up, inviting us here. It's really great to be here. I'm going to start with a poem which I wrote on the occasion of the birth of my daughter, Alma. And the title of the poem is Alma Mala. Mala is an anagram of Alma. But also, a mala is in Buddhism and Hinduism the string of 108 beads used as a kind of rosary for meditation. And so this is a relatively short poem in 108 very short parts. Alma Mala. Alma smiles periwinkle, apple Alma's voice, deer shield Alma sleeps and sleeps, milk and wool for Alma, Alma waking under wing, Alma sleeping early thorn, cumulus Alma's eyes, Alma lies in a lavender basket, bluebell Alma turns her head, Alma's dandelion sneeze, Alma bends her clover knees, damselfly Alma, Alma's wren rain, Alma's smile quickens quince, little Alma looks at orange tips, roll in her meadow brown Alma, brookline Alma sleeps, Alma's talk a sip of milk, Alma's toes wrapped in wool, azalea cradles Alma, soft brush Alma spreads her fingers, foxglove feeding Alma giggles, Alma's smile spring cleaning, straw dot sunshine Alma squints, Alma grizzles alkanet, buttercup open Alma's lips, Carter bee Alma looks in my eyes, Alma's ringlet chin is wet, Alma are you pined with tears, bramble Alma waves her arm, Alma's hair spring grass, among sparrows' voices, Alma's voice. Moon sets, Alma kicks. Alma's warm day and warmer milk. Alma snores a bee at noon. Willow Alma lifts her head. Alma waggles alder arms. Sapling Alma's laughter. Alma's eyes blue twilight. Alma's milk cap grumbles. Alma's afternoon. Under sedum, Alma's hat. Alma rustles purple thorn. Snowdrop Alma squirms. Alma stretches for vetch. Alma's primula gurgles, Alma dribbles daisy, Alma wriggles common blue, woolen Alma's cheeks, Alma murmurs rhododendron, sleeping Alma sneezes, rain gust, Alma gush, cotton Alma's mustard spot, Alma curls in campion, clover Alma's cardigan, Alma's hair grown softer summer, magpie Alma turns her head, sage slinging Alma, rubbing ghee on Alma's cap, Alma yawns dotted clay, fine wool Alma, 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 Alma self-hill scalp, Alma shifts her peony legs, first bath, Alma floats, Alma wakes again, midnight Alma's breath, sheepskin Alma rubs her wrist, Alma's cheeks grow rounder still, Alma speckled wood, lavender smiles of Alma, Alma's hawthorn full of chatter, Alma sees sorrel, now Alma's done crying thistles, don't forget Alma's finch, Alma's ruby tummy, sunny Tuesday, Alma's robin, Alma's safe in siskin wind, lichen even Alma hears, Alma chatters juniper, Alma's goldcrest fern, Alma round on rowan, moon, Alma warbler, Alma sleeps beside a pearl, Alma's sleeping lady fern, woodrush Alma, cinnabar rain when Alma sleeps, pear for Alma's smile, sunlight Alma, Alma's plump forget-me-not, Alma nestles watercress, Alma's weekly birthday, Alma's clean bellflower, poplar Alma, common blue on Alma's basket, white plume Alma's chatter, Alma rolls her hands across the moss, Alma's beach eyes, sunshine Alma's tears, puffball Alma in my arms, parsley Alma sleeps again, Alma mumbles all night feathers, clouds this morning Alma laughs, willow Alma smiles, Alma turns to Silas laughing lilac, Alma's maple family, blueberry Alma's toes, Alma's honeysuckle home. This next piece is something that Richard is going to bring out with Crater Press as a pamphlet, or I'm not quite sure what exactly yet, but it has to do with Freud's reading of Charles Dickens, because Sigmund Freud was a very fond reader of Dickens, and his favorite Dickens novel was The Personal History of David Copperfield. Freud gave a copy of this novel to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, in 1882, in June, just before they were married. It was actually his first present to his soon-to-be wife. In an accompanying letter to Bernays, Freud wrote that of all Dickens' books, Copperfield includes the least stereotypical characters because they were individualized and sinful without being abominable. Now this piece reads through David Copperfield, but resituates sentences from that novel in the form of a Freudian psychoanalytic dictionary. So this is a psychoanalytic dictionary of David Copperfield. Anxiety. Knowing the unfortunate difference between himself and his mother, and what their anxiety of mind was likely to be, I took the liberty of coming home. Association. There is something strange in the shadowy remembrance that I have of my first childish association. Compulsion. I walked on, almost upon compulsion, arm in arm with him. Confession. So much compunction for having ever wronged him, even by a shapeless thought, did I feel within me that the confession of having done so was rising to my lips. Conscience. I had the conscience of an assassin. Death drive. It is as certain as death. Depression. Chapter 35, depression. Disguise. I was in a tremendous state for a minute or so, though I did my best to disguise it. Dora. I began to reflect whether I had done anything to offend her, and my conscience whispered to me that I had not yet told her about Dora. Dreams. Betsy Trotwood Copperfield was forever in the land of dreams and shadows, the tremendous region whence I had so lately traveled. Drive. Drive anywhere. Drive straight on. Father. I thought she had had some fear that her unhappy father might be in some way to blame for what had happened. Forgetting. I was obliged to get her to repeat it, for she spoke it the first time quite down my throat, in consequence of my having forgotten to take my mouth away from the keyhole and put my ear there. Guilt. They were nothing to the guilt I felt. Hysterical. I was still quite hysterical and unable to control my sobs. Ideas. CF association. I must confess that I thought this association of ideas significant. Impulse. I should be thankful to him for having saved me from the first mistaken impulse of my undisciplined heart. Infantile. God knows how infantile the memory may have been that was awakened within me by the sound of my mother's voice. Insanity. This is either insanity or intoxication, said Miss Murdstone. Interpretation. What ravages I committed on my favorite authors in the course of my interpretation of them, I am not in a condition to say, and should be very unwilling to know, but I had a profound faith in them, and I had, to the best of my belief, a simple, earnest manner of narrating what I did narrate. Jokes. This did not save me from more jokes either. Language. To see her lay the flowers against her little dimpled chin was to lose all presence of mind and power of language in a feeble ecstasy. Melancholy. The despairing way in which my mother and I look at each other as I blunder on is truly melancholy. Memory. At all times, nursery tales come up into the memory unrecognized for what they are. Mind. I have an impression on my mind which I cannot distinguish from actual remembrance. Mother. His mother's eye was an evil eye to the rest of the world. Nightmare. I have been a nightmare to myself. Object. Ah, what a strange feeling it was to find that every object I looked at reminded me of the happy old home, which was like a dream I could never dream again. Paralysis. Not paralysis, I hope. Perversion. The man who reviews his own life, as I do mine, is going on here, from page to page, had need to have been a good man indeed, if he would have been spared the sharp consciousness of many talents neglected, many opportunities wasted, many erotic and perverted feelings constantly at war within his breast and defeating him. Phrenology. Strong phrenological developments of the organ of firmness in Mr. Murdstone and his sister, sir. Pleasure principle. My mother answered she had had that pleasure. Projection. She knew no more than I did where he was going, but she thought he had some project shaped out in his mind. Reality principle. There was something fearful in the reality of it. Remembrance. The remembrance of that life is fraught with so much pain to me, with so much mental suffering and want of hope, that I have never had the courage even to examine how long I was doomed to lead it. Remorse. I sit down by the fire thinking with a blind remorse of all those secret feelings I have nourished. Repetition. I was so much dismayed by these words, and particularly by the repetition of the last unknown one, which was a kind of rattle in his throat, that I could make no answer. Repression. I could not repress a vague, uneasy dread that he might find it out. Sex. Nothing but our sex, said Emily, with a burst of tears. Substitute. I provided the best substitute I could by dreaming of dragons until morning. Symbols. There were two great aloes in tubs on the turf outside the windows, the broad, hard leaves of which plant have ever since, by association, been symbolical to me of silence and retirement. Symptom. Much to the discomfiture of Mr. Dick, who knew this to be a bad symptom. Taboo. I have been under a taboo in that infernal scoundrel's service. Talking cure. Whom are you talking to? Transference. My aunt always excused any weakness of her own in my behalf by transferring it in this way to my poor mother. Unconscious. He was so intent upon his own reflections that he was quite unconscious. Wishes. I am not at liberty to consult my own wishes. Words. My spirits sank under these words, and I became very downcast and heavy of heart. Earlier this week, a very fine Canadian poet named Peter Cully died. Very unexpectedly. A relatively young person, died in his sleep. And he wrote, he was based in the west coast of Canada, in Nanaimo, British Columbia, and he wrote several long poems. One of them, most prominently, is the Hammertown poems, and I thought I would just read a very short excerpt because of Peter's passing so recently from the Hammertown poems. Blue from Players Plain, Faro and Coltrane, hopped up hummingbirds, raging on raw honey, oysters and barnacle-scraping soul encounters, buzz the pre-dawn Linwood rain. Blue from Winslow Homer, or someone with no home to go to, he went his finger west and traces out the weather weak, his weakest hunch, a sheriff's gut thrust out for the informer. Blue Sixes, Music and Wine was a song we heard all the time, before the macrobiotic encounter split the silver monitor, the crashing symptoms came complete with waves of foam on yellow gull feet. Blue Moon's a passenger with no ID, and nothing solid in the dictionary, no per diem, no booking fee, no very convincing reason to be alone in swollen solidarity with the puffer, the skink, and the manatee. And the last email I got from Peter was very interesting because I told him I had found his first ever chapbook, which was published in the early 1980s in the British Library. And he said, he was very surprised that it was there. And he said, remember when we used to call them found poems? Anyway, this last piece I'm going to read is from a recent book, 5404-93390. I actually need to have the text on hand in order to read the title myself because I have a lot of difficulty with numbers. And that was one of the reasons why I use this procedure. There is a note here at the beginning which says, in composing this text, I employed an online random integer generator keyed from 0 to 9 to provide a guideline for the numerical weight of each page. So as you can see, the different pages have different length prose poems depending on the number of the randomly generated sequence, which is actually these numbers on the cover. And this was brought out by Beer Press, which I'm extremely thankful to, and I feel very fortunate that this book came out from Beer Press. And part of the rationale actually for this book is the notion that a poet does research, but that research is somewhat different from conventional scholars' research. There are different types of research and different types of working through textual and non-textual material. 5. You began by studying contraptions and drones, their gorgeous honor, their numbers, and their orders, and you allowed them to lull you towards a position. They composed an inaudible sound in your mouth, and they registered this sound as a position shorn of noise. You studied how numbers could impose longer and shorter positions, and how they could formulate your explorations. You studied how to humanize a random set of computations. 4. If those computations were produced by coincidence, who were you to complain? The numbers located your position, and you found that position could not be considered from an outside point of observation, but rather from the point of its fundamental personality as nil. You learned to allocate values to those numbers. 0 for naught, 1 for left, 0. 4. 2 for center, 3 for right, 4 for moon, and so on. The outcome offered by those numbers touched the way you spoke and your production of sound. You learned to stop and go on your voice. You thought the truncated quality of your voice would offer some sort of common opposition, and so you spoke about numbers as though they wore out politics. 9. Possibly you were wrong, though you did not know that then. The truncated sound of your voice piloted you towards your studies of the social. What objects cost, how they spread, their death and the death of nationless pockets of countries, along with the mourning of local foliage and the absolute dominion of acoustic solitude. And of course, the ubiquitous power of domains, rooms, and their owners. You formulated notes and located them in position, but that was not enough. So you turned to reading stories which you thought had been cut adrift from their social moorings, as though such an occurrence was ever possible. You pondered those stories, confused, unable to count them or to account for their improbable contents. Abandoning all, you studied how to soar among clouds, and you soared. 3. You turned among clouds to locate a home in air. You saw a face grow darkly near the luster of her hair, until you learned to disappear, until no residue survived, no monikers, not even the optimistic moonlight, which was void and shadowless. 3. And which encompassed the thousands of clouds, while you stood with one toe in a cup of water and the other in a wall socket. Nor the vanishing point, nor the null set of calculation, no. No one supposed that you had learned how to be spacey with undertones. 9. No one supposed that you understood how to be dismembered, for you had chosen to deploy an age-old formula to throw your joints and bones towards an otherworldly position, where you learned about prototypes of love. You turned into one obsessed with sums and how they organized your joints and bones, collecting them around your otherworldly position. You became lonely and lost in that otherworldly position, but refused to ignore your vocation. You called it soul, and you thought you heard it shouting for coherence. Moreover, from that position, your joints learned to cure, and your bones learned to love, and your torso became heroic with numbers. Your meditations revolved your skeleton around and through equations, and your joints and bones were reconstituted by those equations. 0. 6. Turning tough and durable, they solidified as the iron joints and bones of compassion. You learned from them how to avoid problematic orgasms, how to avoid the troublesome orgasms of that otherworldly position, and how to embody those orgasms with love. Humbled, you turned your love towards your bones and joints. They became the spouse of your early explorations, and you continued on with them, short of social position. Or so you thought. Who proved you wrong? 5. You had heard of a communal erotic, how orgasm could offer social revolution. And so your mouth was crowded with a throng. You opened your lungs to romance, and you swallowed organic food, and you spoke about the politics of psychoerotic orientation. You studied throngs, lungs, pastures, and meadows. And you studied how pastures and meadows could organize your bones and joints. 2. During your moments of jubilant contour with bones and joints, you also wondered what you had learned from advocating meadows and pastures. 2. Although you were fond of donning meadows and pastures, you found your maneuvers couldn't provide the answers you were looking for. 0. 9. You wondered how those bones and joints could improve the world, and you studied your local contacts, who worked towards that goal to no avail. Some of them found you too bourgeois, your scope too narrow for social contradictions. Sometimes you concurred. You understood none of your studies, but you sustained hope in your methodology, your organs, and your numbers, and you saw how those organs and numbers were shared among all, and were therefore social. And you learned that some of those organs and numbers returned from the social, bereaved from all accounts. Nonetheless, you hoped that your voluptuous, over-the-top sums and your disembodied studies of organs and numbers would allow for some sort of contribution. 2. And so your voluptuous, over-the-top sums hung low from your trousers, while you pondered how your appearance colluded with rock and roll, with Gregorian chants and soul and dub. 6. And also with opera's opulence, the soprano's throat gone euphoric from warming up with drones. Her drones showed you, on the contrary, how your love denoted a position at its most responsive, its most joyous. Her drones showed you how to move toward its addition, and also how to foster your equations in their absence, how to count on more remote positions, disembodied. They told you to go abroad, to learn about love and numbers among far-removed lands, and they vanished. Vamoose. 7. So you voyaged on to a totally scorched country, where you discovered how to become the burning bush of your own loosened hip joint. You studied the color of stones at the dome of the rock, salmon rose at sundown. In the Peruvian foothills, you studied sleepless organs and rustic saliva, and you stood indolent under the moon, scrounging, horrified, and blooming with problems. All of this looked four-dimensional to you, like a spontaneous cure, but it was also full of love and the joy of orgasms, and you monitored your learning with numerical assurance. 5. You voyaged then to European woodlands, where you learned to move through water whooshing over stones in a snowstorm, alone, looking towards a blue, lost location, surrounded by movies and photographs of glaciers, and where you also looked on people who blossomed from kneeling. They lived in a hive. The hive absorbed your education, turning you to a collection of floating cells, a sort of epiphenomenon of supernovas. 1. On their way to becoming supernova remnants. 9. You studied a black hole where death resides, the anti-womb, a non-existent cave between your legs, which you sought to satiate, but which offered only murder. And you became romantic with cold. Each year the winter's barren oscillations dotted you like something fallen, something savored by crows near an inland ocean. You looked through a hole in a flag. You turned with the stars that rolled above, surrounded by hues of sundown and tones of refusal, under a glowing tower, neighboring the call to prayer. You gave yourself over to a drone enfolded by a sun. That winter you poured slow water into a porcelain bowl. Then you washed your joints and bones. You broke the bowl over a mound of foliage. You allowed the water to soak through all of the foliage until it turned to sodden blocks of pulp. 2. You positioned the sodden blocks of pulp about your skull so that you were unable to see, smell, or hear. This tradition taught you again to love. 6. As long as you lay unconscious in those European woodlands, you absorbed that love, cradled by mountains and dumbstruck for eons. How heavy the months had become. You lost yourself on those forest footpaths, only to be born again as a conduit for adoration. Your devotion summoned you to be a companion to supernovas, to adolescence and to centuries, to fondness for nocturnal topics, somber in those walled towns, surrounded by primordial wood lore and the omnipotence of numbers, erroneous, positional, somnambulistic. 1. Oh, if only a storm would explode the fog in which your future slumbered, fumbling and guiltless. 5. A silhouette of your education was thrown along the road when you learned to huddle your mouth on a shroud, on a sum. Further south, you studied aeronautics, mass, density, the substance of wings, the curve of feathers. All of this was sure and unsophisticated, and you took it around. Mass, density, the curve of an owl, the substance of an angel. You studied how those objects folded round a nest. Voyaging to the island of Livorno. 9. You continued to study like a cloud of fire, like a corpse within its grave, like a dome of many-colored glass, like a pale flower by some sad maiden cherished, like a wayward girl, like an atmosphere, like an infant smile, like an unbodied joy whose race has just begun, like autumnal night, like clouds in starlight widely spread, like clouds which have outwept their rain, like darkness to a dying flame, like earth's decaying leaves, like incarnations of the stars, like moonbeams behind some piney mountain shower, like pageantry of mist on an autumnal stream, like shattered mountains, like stars of heaven, like stars to their appointed height they climb, like stars, like the bright hair uplifted from the head, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. 3. Sometimes you were messy, though you dubbed yourself uneven. You studied variables and uneven vowels. You struggled with the problem of the almost constant, and you sought an antidrone to overturn your learning. 3. For a change of tone, you moved to post-war Brooklyn, where you studied chop suey on Dolores Street and pound cake at Woolworth's, and you bought an ugly Mayan codex to dig what the ladies of Oaxaca were doing in those days. 6. Then on to the school for delinquent boys of Latin American origin, where Senorita La Chata, first name Lola you once heard, didn't even stop breathing for once in her life. And in the military service, you bought a little coffin for Joselito and Paco and Pepe, with publicity by the Dean of Lush Workers. Although you did think of Old Faithful, Trans Enrique El Culito, or The Dream Police, or My Chicken Blood Ruby by Gertie La Sing Sing, but you didn't. You stuck with the coffin, though it was cold and somewhat warmed your neck. 8. You left Brooklyn and discovered in Missouri how exciting it was not to be the first paperback edition of a $4 Grove Press bestseller. You made a great mistake at the Great Fence. What you didn't know lay dead by the Great Fence, shotgun at his side, how frozen he was, how pale a statue, how full of galaxies. You wondered if you were in that part of Missouri where fun-loving novelists lay squirming in the river. For it wasn't enough to say, fine thing, when you had professional witches on the payroll, or the basic formula of need, which is the face of evil and cannot be quarantined. You asked everyone if your research should be associated with present or future professional riches. 8. You moved to the coast and learned that Honeyface was coming on the wrong day, so you went home to bed, and lots of names drifted through your head. The Queen Bee, the old...